evening, hello and welcome. You're with our special coverage here. Good morning. You're with our special coverage on the booster dose budget, a budget that is the 10th budget of the Narendra Modi government, the third in the shadow of COVID. And there's plenty to look forward to because this time we're combining the power of India today with the power of business today. Now,
so two marquee brands getting together to power the business coverage. I want to go across this morning to Udayan Mukherjee joining us from London, where it is a very unearthly hour. Udayan, good morning. Nice to see you bright and chirpy on Budget Morning.
Who said I'm bright and chirpy? This
We're
is the
trying
facade,
to pump you
Rahul.
up. Just pump you up and get you
3:30
going.
in the morning. Yeah. Well, a good budget may just get me going. Yeah, but good morning to all of you. It's wonderful to be joining you from here. Fantastic.
Okay,
you mentioned good budget. I just wanted to get a sense from you. What, according to you, then makes a good budget? What is that budget what is the defining characteristic of a budget that makes it a good budget?
Well, this time around, Rajdeep, I would say that all the people who will float through our studios today, from morning to evening, probably need this budget the least because corporate India has actually had it the best in years. They're doing quite well now. Earnings are recovering. I think demand is pretty strong. Exports have recovered. And I think after a long time, there is a fairly virtuous cycle for corporate India, the kind of guests who will talk to a lot through the course of the day. I don't think the budget is required for them beyond a point. So I would say in my book, the budget should do just 2 or 3 things. One, of course, rev up the capex budget for next year, the capital expenditure budget for next year by 25-30%, because that has a multiplier effect, that creates jobs, and that needs to be done. Doing that, the government needs to spend all the unutilized cash on the capex front quickly, because we need to get that out of the gate. Once that is done, you focus on the fiscal deficit a little bit because we need to show the world that we are getting back to a path of fiscal consolidation. So if the fiscal deficit is 6.8% this year, we need to show that we are going to 6.3 or 6.4% next year. That will generally be liked and cheered by all. So capex, fiscal deficit, and once these two are done, focus all your time, energy and resources on the bottom end of the pyramid. That is where India's problem is. It is not with the corporate sector. It is not with the stock market. These two clusters need the finance minister the least this year. Where we are needed, where the finance resources are needed is really at the bottom end because we have a very big problem out there. This K-shaped thing cannot last beyond a point. So I would say a budget which would please me is a budget which does not necessarily please all our studio experts today from the corporate sector, but people who are not there in the studios, who are the marginalized and the lower end of the pyramid.
Interesting. The alphabet has changed from V to K.
But Sanjeev Sanyal yesterday used the letter W. He said the best man's minds sat together. W indicating a sharp bounce back, another fall which is less deep, a shallow fall, and then a bounce again. But the fact is, the more realistic depiction is the letter K, where those who were relatively well off have seen their income levels go up. Those who were the lower end of the income strata have seen their incomes crash. And that really is one of the key challenges for Nirmala Sitharaman in that budget today. 23 finance ministers in independent India, only 8 of whom have presented 4 budgets. This will be Nirmala Sitharaman's 4 budget. Let's take you through the headlines we're tracking this morning.
India awaits its booster shot budget. Nirmala Sitharaman reaches the finance ministry, will table the union budget at 11 a.m. The Modi government's 10th budget, third in the shadow of the pandemic.
Economic Survey 2022-23 pegs GDP growth at 8 to 8.5, portrays revival of economic activity to pre-pandemic levels. Opposition says survey ignores poverty and unemployment.
Private sector investment struggling to get back on track. Will this be a priority now for the government or not?
Public seeks tax incentives from the finance minister. Will Nirmala Sitharaman go populist with her budget announcements today on income tax?
Industry seeks clarity on crypto regulations. Fintech companies seek tax benefits. Will the finance minister address the cryptocurrency taxation issue?
We're getting live images of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman right outside North Block with what is called the Bahi Khata. It used to be a leather briefcase earlier. She's flanked by the economic secretaries, and this move from having the traditional, very English style briefcase to the Bahi Khata, it's an interesting move. Oh, then your sense of the responsibilities Nirmala Sitharaman carries. She's grayed a lot on account of the pandemic and on account of how the economy has been faring, but this could be when the worst is behind us and we could see the economy recover from this whole dark shadow of the pandemic now.
I hope you're right, Rahul, and the signs are good for India. We are in a fairly good spot in terms of macro stability. As I said, after a long time, we are seeing earnings recovering, and while corporate earnings are important, is that once you get a virtuous cycle with corporate earnings, capex starts to pick up. You know, through this day today, you'll hear a lot, Rahul, about what the government should do with capital expenditure to have a multiplier effect on jobs. But the truth is that government capex is only 2.5% of GDP. Actually, the government is a very marginal player in the capex space. The real big elephant in that space is corporate India. When companies start to spend, that is when you will see a great economic momentum come about. So the government's role, Nirmala Sitharaman's role, is only to be an enabler. And in that, she's done quite a bit by cutting corporate taxes to 25% a year ago. And at that, I think, has given India the space to go out and spend on a capex recovery. So I think the government's role should now be seen in the light of not focusing so much on the corporate side, but on what, as I said, the bottom end of the pyramid, because we don't have a job situation, good job situation. We have a terrible unemployment situation, and inflation is rising, which is hurting the poor. So I think we need a big SME package, because that's where the thrust of the recovery from the government should be. So I think we need to, all this talk about capital gains tax and all of this, it's
Nirmala Sitharaman there, flanked by TV Somanathan, the Finance Secretary, and also Secretary in the Department of Expenditure. You have Ajay Seth there, Department of Economic Affairs, Debashish Panda, Department of Financial Services. And Raj, the interesting thing is, if you speak to officers in the administrative services, some of these officers, like a Tarun Bajaj or a Somanathan, are generally seen by their peers as being the brightest of their generation. And therefore, she does have the economic heft within government, for what it's worth, to bring this budget together. And if you see over the pandemic, where several other countries opened their purse strings, spent recklessly, India was conservative, which was criticized by many experts in India and internationally. But in the end, as we start emerging from this pandemic, may not have been such a bad thing to do.
The jury is still out, because I think at the end of the day, the income inequalities are stark. I mean, the figures show 84% of household incomes have gone down in the last 2 years. So I think the challenge lies, it's not an easy challenge. Let's be clear. Let's not minimize the challenge that this government has faced in the last 2 years of the pandemic in terms of reviving growth. The fact, though, is that we've had, since 2017 first quarter, a sense that the economy hasn't really taken off post-demonetization. And I think there are serious concerns on private investment, on consumption, on stimulating demand. So there is the crisis that Udayan spoke about, of those at the bottom of the pyramid who are struggling because of unemployment, because of falling incomes. But there is also the need to stimulate private investment, and the government is in a good fiscal position. The strength is exports are good, but importantly, the fiscal situation looks good. So will the government use this budget to push money into the economy to kickstart growth? I mean, that is the challenge that Nirmala Sitharaman has. But you're right. She has a fine team of bureaucrats, by all accounts, with her. So there is no reason why the government cannot take advantage of the opportunity now that most of this country is vaccinated and the worst of the pandemic seems to be over.
Joining us now live on India Today and Business Today's coverage of the Union Budget, I want to introduce Subhash Chandra Garg, former Finance Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, has been involved in some of the most critical Modi Sarkar budgets, understands the ins and outs, the minutiae of budget making. We had his insights last year, benefited immensely from them. Dr. Garg, it's a pleasure to have you back. Shankar Iyer joins us, our former colleague, author, ace economy and political analyst, always has some of the sharpest takes on the budget. We have Saurav Majumdar with us. Saurav is the editor of Business Today magazine. Shamika Ravi joins us, Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation. She tracks the real economy as much as the financial markets and therefore has some very interesting insights on what's happening out in the real world, as it were. Nikhil Kamath joins us. Nikhil is the founder and CEO of Zerodha, one of the startup sensations, making a huge difference also to a lot of younger millennial investors in smaller towns coming in, participating on platforms such as his. And there's been so much talk about the India startup story, Nikhil, in the build-up to this budget. And yesterday we heard from the economic survey that Delhi and not Bangalore is India's startup capital now. As somebody who represents New India, as it were, what are the expectations that you have from this budget? What is it that you think Nirmala Sitharaman could do to propel New India into the next gear?
I'd like to contest that and continue to think that, Bangalore is Bangalore is, like the heart of startups in India. Well, from the standpoint of our industry, if I were to talk from a stock investor, trader's perspective, I think the changes that we've been asking have been common for a while now. Security transaction tax, which we've been looking forward to, it being rationalized in some manner. We've been asking for that for a long time. The impact cost going up while somebody is trading makes a market less robust. I feel personally that if security transaction tax was done away with, a lot more foreign capital would be attracted to coming into the country and investing here. Outside of that, taxation on derivatives, if you're on the highest slab, derivatives as a tool is very useful for people to hedge and build more robust portfolios where risk is curtailed to a large extent. Reducing taxation on derivatives will go a long way in helping retail investors build better portfolios. We're in the asset management space, category 3 alternate investment funds. There is no pass-through taxation like there is available in Cat 1 and Cat 2. I think it's again another tool which brings in a lot of capital into the equity markets. And something, some kind of a rationalization there will help the ecosystem as well. So Rahul, demands are plenty, but I think we all recognize what the problem is. I think a very small section of society today, maybe 1% or 2% pays tax. And I do not know if the government has enough gunpowder just based on that to bring a lot of, changes that will probably help India grow faster in the next decade.
Okay, Udayan has a question for you, Nikhil. Just let's see what Udayan has for you.
Yeah, Nikhil, hi, Udayan this side. Every time a budget comes around, whatever the priorities are, there is always a whiff of whether long-term capital gains tax rates will go up this time or not, because that has the potential of destabilizing market sentiment. What are your thoughts on that, and whether it is justified this time around, or whether there is a chance that something like that might happen?
Well, I have a slightly contrarian view on that. I think at the current rate, if you hold something for longer than 12 months, you're paying 10% in surcharge. I don't think that's a hindrance to the ecosystem. When people are making a profit and, somebody has invested and done well in the market, I don't think they have an issue paying tax, especially at that 10%. Even if it were to go up to like 13, 14, 15%, I don't think would be a deal breaker. The bigger issue in my mind are, these indirect taxes like STT, which kind of make it more expensive for people to trade. If you look at the retail ecosystem in India today, retail investors and traders lose more money to STT than they do to, everything else combined. I mean, like what they lose to the market, what they lose in brokerage. So I would feel like, focus has to be on taxes like that, which one is paying even when he makes a profit or, makes a loss, he's paying the tax. That makes the ecosystem a bit inefficient. I think we need to do away with stuff like that if we were to be competitive on a global level and attract even more capital into the country.
So the challenge that...
Well, we'll talk more about all of the capital markets.
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead, Rajdeep.
Just to go ahead with what you flagged off, Udayan, at the very start, that this budget will be determined by the ability of this government to lift people at the bottom of the pyramid or give them a sense of hope. Let me go quickly around the panel to get your quick reactions to that. What would you like to see in the budget to really kickstart the economy? Shamika, Ravi, why don't you start first? To give a sense to those at the bottom of the pyramid, a sense that this is not an unequal country, an unequal economy.
So, Rajdeep, I expect a welfareist budget this year with focus on jobs. I think it's very clear in almost all public data sets that consumption has fallen significantly for the bottom 80%. In fact, 1890 or 1920, if you look at the PLFS quarter-to-quarter changes, we were actually picking up rather well. So job creation was happening at a pace, but then the pandemic has really been devastating as far as the job market has been concerned. So this year in particular, I expect the budget to have a longer term view on these structural issues rather than small time tinkering.
Shankar Iyer, yesterday when you were on my show, you seemed to suggest that the government should not go for these big bang welfare schemes. They don't know how to deal with them. But there's been talk of an urban employment guarantee scheme, possibly creating some kind of schemes that provide relief for those at the bottom of the pyramid.
Well, there's a reason why I say that is that government's delivery mechanism, when it does large-scale programs, is very inefficient. I would rather the government transfer direct use. So here's the thing. We have a mechanism called e-rupee. It is purpose-specific, person-specific, and it can be made extinguishable. So what if the government used e-rupee to transfer money to people to educate their children who are being pulled out of schools? What if the government transferred money for people to skill themselves, upskill themselves, reskill themselves? Fine. What if the government used that money to recompense or compensate home-owned businesses which are struggling? That's fine. But don't start another umbrella program which nobody can track. So as far as the urban Narega is concerned, yes, urban people have been hit. There's a large, the poverty ratio has shifted considerably. And so what would you do? Do you have a roster? Do you have database on urban people? So a negative tax credit, like Friedman used to say, may work. Or maybe you could transfer money through DBT to Aadhaar-based Jandan accounts, which are urban localities. Now, all these schemes have implementation issues. And finally, remember, Rajdeep, all of the welfare that is suggested by the government of India is undertaken by the state governments. Do the state governments have the capacity to do it? As I said yesterday, they are sitting on cash, not filling up. 1/5 of the police personnel posts are vacant. 1/5 of the teacher posts are vacant. 45 to 50,000 medical posts or healthcare posts are vacant. Why aren't they filling it?
Okay, let's take that also to Mr. Garg. Mr. Garg, your sense, what would it take? What would you like to see? Would you like to see these big ticket welfare programs that Shamika Ravi spoke about, that she expects in this budget?
The government's flexibility to undertake many programs or even to expand the allocations for the welfare schemes is very limited. I think we should keep that in mind when we expect the finance minister to do something. Just to give you an example, the biggest program for transfer of funds or money to the poor is the Narega program, right? That would need to be provided for. The other program which the government runs is this Atmanirbhar Rozgar Yojana, which is very poorly designed. It gives some provident fund assistance to the people in the organized sector. The largest program which transfers money to the people is actually the food subsidy program, which would cost this year something like 4 lakh crores. And that, in fact, covers much of the waste which happens in the form of the FCI. Just to give you an example, wheat today, the economic cost is about 33 rupees a kg. Farmers are paid 20, and the rest 13 is virtually the overhead and the other cost which the government has. So while the government pays 33 rupees to the FCI, the people, only the farmers get benefit. Consumers actually don't get any benefit. If you can change this 4 lakh crore scheme into direct transfers for farmers in the form of instead of procurement, and to the consumers instead of paying to the FCI, you can actually transfer much better money and much greater money to the people and create demand and avoid the wastage. Likewise, if you look at the remaining budget which the government has, the flexibility, maneuverability is very small.
Okay.
So I think we should keep that in mind when we expect the government to do much more.
I want to introduce now one of our key force multipliers in this budget coverage, the budget intelligence dashboard. And what we're able to do over here, like we do on counting day and then election, is actually track whether it is any of the sectoral spends of the government or the Prime Minister's pet schemes, how the allocations to different sectors have moved during the budget, because some of this comes through in the budget speech. A lot of it isn't spoken of immediately, and we'll be able to track and process that for you so that you have a sense of how the numbers move. But what I want to look at right now is the GDP growth number, because the important thing here is the economic survey which was presented yesterday talks about growth being between 8 and 8.5%, which is less than what the IMF projected, but that's the expectation. Here it is, between 8.8 to 8.5. This after 9.2 being the current estimate for how the economy is grown in the current year. Udayan, the important thing here for everyone to look at is not just that growth is now back to pre-pandemic levels, because at some point in time that had to happen, but the growth trajectory, the trajectory of growth, are we at the same incline that we were pre the pandemic, or how long it will take to be able to go from where we are to the same curve at the speed at which the Indian economy was growing before this pandemic hit us?
Actually, Rahul, we had a GDP growth problem even before the pandemic, because Indian GDP was not growing at a very fast pace. We were getting stuck at around 5.5–6% or just above 6%. So I think it's a fallacy to say that pre-pandemic India was roaring in terms of GDP growth. In fact, we had 2 or 3 years of a fairly anemic kind of GDP growth. So not only do we have to get back to that trajectory that you're alluding to, we actually have to refine the way to get back to 8% plus kind of growth. So I'll say 2 things to your question. One is that it is important that we have a respectable GDP growth number, because we need to not necessarily get 17.5% nominal GDP this time around, which was a surprise that the finance minister, or the bounty which she's dealing with, but we need to get to at least a 14% kind of a nominal GDP growth, which should be the basis for strong revenue assumptions on which the budget is crafted for FY23. So that part is important. But I think all this obsession about the GDP number and whether it's 8% or 9% and whether we are the 3rd largest and whether we're getting to 5 trillion, I think it obfuscates much of the problems. And I like to think of it this way. Think of a building with 10 flats. In one flat stays Mukesh Ambani, in one flat Gautam Adani, in the 3rd flat an employee of the State Bank of India, and in the other 7 flats you have people who are unemployment, struggling for jobs, or people whose incomes have been dashed by what has happened over the last couple of years. When you look at the whole building, when you ask, how's the building doing? You will say the building is doing very well, but that is completely skewed by the 2 occupants in those 2 flats. The rest of the occupants are actually doing pretty poorly. So I think that is the GDP number, the sum of all those 10 flats. But when you disaggregate that, I think underneath there is a lot of pain, which the finance minister will not be oblivious to, and she cannot be oblivious to.
Sure. 2 green shoots that we're seeing. One, tax collections continuing to be healthy. The economic survey talks about how the government has headroom to be able to spend. Where should the government be spending that money? Plus, we're seeing exports now at a decade high. So can that sustain? So we have a lot to talk about as we build up to this booster shot budget. Our coverage continues on the other side of a very quick break. We're back in a moment. Stay with us.
Crypto Watch brought to you by BitBNS.
Information is not knowledge. The only source of knowledge is experience. As the day of reckoning draws closer, Siddharth Zarabi, Rajdeep Sardesai, Rahul Kanwal and Udyan Mukherjee, with 30 plus years of budget reporting experience, India's leading English news channel and India's #1 business magazine, two mega brands get together to bring you the most comprehensive coverage of the coming budget 2022. India Today Roundtable Goa. Listen to leaders like Pramod Sawant, Arvind Kejriwal, Mahua Moitra, P. Chidambaram, Devendra Fadnavis, Sanjay Raut, Sudhin Dhavalikar, Vijay Sardesai, Utpal Parikar, Amit Palekar, Randeep Singh Surjewala, and many others only at India Today Roundtable Goa, 3rd February 2022.
You are watching India Today.
Information is not knowledge. The only source of knowledge is experience. As the day of reckoning draws closer, Siddharth Zarabi, Rajdeep Sardesai, Rahul Kanwal and Udyan Mukherjee, with 30 plus years of budget reporting experience, India's leading English news channel and India's #1 business magazine, two mega brands get together to bring you the most comprehensive coverage of the coming budget 2022. India Today Roundtable Goa, listen to leaders like Pramod Sawant, Arvind Kejriwal, Mahua Moitra, P. Chidambaram, Devendra Fadnavis, Sanjay Raut, Sudhin Dhavalikar, Vijay Sardesai, Utpal Parikar, Amit Palekar, Randeep Singh Surjewala, and many others only at India Today Roundtable Goa, 3rd February 2022.
The biggest fight in Indian politics. Who will win the big battle of Uttar Pradesh?
बदलिए सरकार को। क्या कर रहे हो? कौन सा विकास किया है? क्या रामलला का मंदिर कांग्रेस के लोग बना पाते क्या?
All the ground reportage on India's election channel, Battleground Uttar Pradesh, only on India Today.
You are watching India Today.
You're watching India Today, and Business Today's live and continuing coverage of the booster dose budget. I want to spend a moment talking about disinvestment because if you look at the government's track record so far, they've been missing their disinvestment targets in most years. In the last year, only 16% of the 2.1 lakh crore rupees, which was set as the disinvestment target, was realized. So far, 7% of the 1.75 lakh crore rupees has been realized, even though another 12,000 crore rupee disinvestment for Neelachal Ispat went through yesterday to Tata Steel Long. The critical question though now, Shankar, is will the government, on the back of what they've done with Air India, be able to push through on disinvestment and privatization with real purpose and energy, which would be the hope after Air India? Or do you think just the general lethargy that tends to cripple the system will hold things back, and we'll still see, as we have in years in the past, the realization of the disinvestment targets being much lesser than the ambitious targets that Nirmala Sitharaman before her Arun Jaitley laid out?
But, the targets continue to be there, and one thing that is visible post the disinvestment of Air India is that it requires much more than an announcement. It required somebody to carry and champion the cause. A similar enthusiasm I don't see in the dilution of stakes in public sector banks, which has been announced. There are various numbers, 30%, 33%, 26%, whatever the dilution. The other part is, why should it take so long to value LIC? When the going was, in the markets were on the up, we should have had LIC position for the IPO. But a larger question, Rahul, is what is the role of public sector in an economy that has been opened up to the private sector? The cohabitation of public sector in domains open to the private sector leads to losses, and there are several examples of it. 20 years back, they blocked the disinvestment of Air India. They blocked and BPCL was called strategic. Now BPCL is on the block. The question that the Modi government has to answer is what it will own, what it will manage, and what it will sell. It has to figure out the role. And the second part is, as long as these ministries are under the administrative hold of politicians or are politically managed, this investment process will be slow. So the ideal situation is for India to create a Temasek like a holding company and park all the assets of the government in that and take economic calls rather than political calls. The important thing is...
Let's on that note, take economic calls, not political calls. Big call to say that, because that is unlikely to happen. But Udayan, look at the markets. No one knows that better than you. Sensex up 683 points. Is that typical on budget day that we get a boost just ahead of the budget, and then perhaps reality tends to sink in?
You know, Rajdeep, I would say this, that today maybe the market is excited about the budget, but the real driver of the budget right now is what is going on with global markets, with what's going on with interest rate hikes across the world. That is leading to an enormous amount of volatility. So once the dust settles after this evening, I think the market will go back to tracking global cues, because something very powerful is happening across the world in terms of inflation raising its ugly head and interest rates going up after a very, very long time. And that, I think, will be the dominant theme of 2022. The markets will swing to that tune rather than anything that Nirmala Sitharaman might do in the budget this time round. I hope she doesn't do anything which rocks India's boat, because we are in a nice place in terms of macro. But I don't think the market swings to the budget speed unless something transformative, which usually does not happen in the budgets in India, comes about. So I think markets are about global markets and interest rates and inflation, which are the key things that we need to focus on this year as well, because we are talking so much about what the finance minister can do. But I think an equally important thing is what the Reserve Bank of India will do this year, because we have got changes in monetary policy afoot after a long time.
Mr. Garg, you want to respond to what was earlier said about disinvestment? You've been in government. The targets clearly of 2021 have not been met in 2022. Air India successful disinvestment. But do you believe that political calls are taken rather than economic calls from your experience in government?
So let's put some of these things right. Number one, this Neelanchal revenues is not 12,000 crores entirely, it's the entire enterprise value. Second, it doesn't come to the government. It is owned by some PSUs and all. So let's not count this into the disinvestment revenue of the government, number one. Number two, LIC issue is considered as the major one on which the entire government is working. There are serious issues about its valuation. Not much has been discussed about it. The LIC makes profit of only about 3,000 crores a year. If you value the company to, let us say, 9 to 10 lakh crores, you are actually putting the value 300 times than what it is. So I suspect that in the interest of gaining or garnering more of resources from LIC, the government may end up overvaluing the LIC, which will create problems for its future disinvestments. There's been a suggestion that some of the value or the profits which go for the shareholders can be transferred to the go to the policy holders, can be transferred to the shareholders. If that you do, LIC is not a very efficient investment manager. It earns much less returns than others do it. Then you will hurt the core business. So my sense is that the disinvestment revenue this year, 1.75 lakh crores, is nowhere likely to be achieved. The government may place it at about 1.2, 1.3 lakh crores, considering that LIC might give you 1 lakh, but that would create future problems. The bigger issue is what Shankar was saying, is that the government need not be in the business of business. All the public sector undertakings which are there and profitable, whether it's in the energy sector or whether it's in the oil space or in some of the mineral space and all of them now are being done very well by the private sector. There is no need for the government to run steel mills when we have 80-85% capacity there.
So but we've been saying that for over a decade and nothing has changes. That's the point.
Also, Rajdeep,
that's the problem. The political problem, what you are referring, is that as a policy we don't get it clear that we need to get out. Government said about maximum governance, minimum government, but that has not been implemented. In fact, we have far more ministries today than we had 5 years, 6 years back. So the privatization agenda, the public sector reforms agenda actually is not getting implemented. By the way, just for information, still the government puts more equity investment than it disinvestments. Last 3 years budget, if you look at it, the equity investment by the government is over 2 lakh crores. What comes out of the disinvestment is, in last 2 years, it's not even 25 to 30,000 crores per annum. So I think we will need to take it very holistically and a very clear policy view that how do we want to deal with the public sector.
Okay. Will the government struggle with raising the right kind of valuation for some of these disinvestment prospects? Because remember, the last year was in several senses a brilliant year for the stock markets. That could have been ideal timing, but the government wasn't able to on account of the second wave and then Omicron push through as planned. I want to show you how foreign portfolio investment has been faring over the last few years and especially over just the last few months. And the question to you, Dayan, is whether it's a bit of a missed opportunity. When the government had the opportunity of easy availability of funds internationally, money coming into India, they could they have at that time, if it was, for example, one of the oil companies or LIC, raised more money through these disinvestment proceeds, and given that now the Federal Reserve, for example, will be raising interest rates, that would impact the availability of money globally. Would this then not be the ideal timing, or does it even matter? Should the government be trying to time what might be the right time to come out with some of these, whether it's an IPO or a strategic disinvestment?
You see what happened last year, Rahul. I mean, company after company in the digital technology space did its IPOs, raised billions of dollars. Some of them have fallen on the wayside or to the wayside since then. I mean, you've seen what has happened with Paytm, and now even Zomato is trading below its IPO price. This has also soured the pitch for the IPO market. This is not the ideal time for LIC to be doing an IPO, least at all at the kind of valuations Mr. Garg was just alluding to. I don't think it will fly that easily. And things are complicated by what you just mentioned about global markets. We have volatility this year. So I don't think FY22 or 2022 will be an ideal year for the government to go out and pitch inefficient enterprises in the market and get top dollar valuation. So if they miss the boat in 2021, I very much fear that the going will be quite tough in 2022 as well. And as Mr. Garg correctly points out, much of those eggs are in the LIC basket, because if LIC does not go through at a good valuation, we are not getting anywhere close to 1.5 or 2 lakh crores in 2022 either. But this is the problem for the government. You're talking about creating fiscal space. I mean, yesterday there was a lot of talk about it. But this year, if we don't get, say, 1.5 lakh crores on divestment, close to 1.5 lakh crores from the asset monetization plan, and maybe another 50,000 odd crores from 5G spectrum, on which the government needs to come down from its high horse and think about fair pricing. If the three don't happen, then you cannot create that 3 to 4 lakh crores of additional fiscal space, which we need to invest in capex and in relief, in revenue expenditure as well, in programs like NREGA. So I think that is one big element of this budget. How do we get cracking, executing and not announcing, and creating this fiscal space from government asset sales?
One of the fears the economic survey talks about is importing inflation from abroad. I want to show on the budget intelligence dashboard, as I bring Dr. Shamika Ravi in, if you look, for example, at the inflation numbers, consumer price index, consumer inflation still relatively moderate recently, but wholesale price index, seeming to be under stress. And given the fact that you've got Brent crude at now $90 a barrel, you've got stress between Ukraine and Russia, this whole fear of imported inflation, would that be one of the big X factors in the year to come when it comes to determining how India actually emerges from the shadow of the pandemic?
Well, absolutely, Rahul. I think there will be an effort to try and give that cushion as much as possible. But I think inflation for us is still, given the bandwidth within which the RBI likes to function, I think it's not yet as much of a concern as it is in the global markets. But I do want to go back to the point of privatization. You see, we are pretending as if the conversation is really one between politics and economics. And I really think the gorilla in the room is the judiciary. It's the courts. Now, we've done speech analysis of finance ministers over the last 50 years. it was really during the Vajpayee regime that we had serious, we had a ministry, dedicated to privatization. And after that, you saw that during the UPA, and this is where the politics works in, it was totally put on the back burner. So now the effort which is now being made, and I think Nirmala Sitharaman's speech last year was therefore, I think, quite remarkable, is that the strategy of financing growth and infrastructure spending based on privatization and asset monetization, that strategy came out rather clearly. Now, the difficulty is what we have to appreciate and not just say that it's politics playing in. I think the difficulty is in finally implementing this and the courts allowing it, for it to happen. So it's not the political left that one is concerned about at this point. It is truly the court system, which is an impediment as far as the privatization efforts in India are concerned.
Those are images of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman with the President Kovind, and Rajdeep, she holds the record in 2020 of the longest budget speech. 2 hours, 40 minutes was her budget speech, so 160 minutes. She couldn't finish the last 2 pages, had to cut down the size of the speech. So hopefully this time, a shorter, more crisper speech than that.
That's right. I mean, unfortunately in India, you would expect budget speeches to become shorter rather than longer over the years. A lot of the taxation, for example, has been pulled out with GST having its own mechanism in place. And you would think that in the times in which we live, people would have shorter, crisper speeches. But obviously, Indians love everything elongated, whether it's a 5-day test match and or a long budget speech. I thought we were in the T20 era. And I sometimes wonder why that happens. Subhash Garg, you worked with finance ministers as former finance secretary. What is the temptation to have a long speech? Isn't it better to find a way in the times in which we live to have shorter budget speeches, which in a sense is an income expenditure statement, and you then put 4 or 5 key points? Why do you think there's this temptation to go on for a 2-hour plus speech in the times in which we live?
I think this is quite simple. Budget speech basically has 3 kinds of things. One, it talks about the fiscal programs and measures. Second, it talks about the economic policies and all. But the third thing, which has increasingly grown over the years, is you present a report. You want to reach out to all the constituencies in the world, whether it's the farmers, whether it's the MSMEs, workers, youth, whatever you name, you have to reach. And then you describe in the budget speech a lot of things, what you have done to serve their interest or to reach out to them. In fact, 40 to 45% of the budget speech today is literally made of which is not what is being announced or what is being done or what is being proposed. It is basically what has been done, which actually should have been somewhere else or not being there. So if you cut down this temptation or the compulsion to sort of sing your song about what you have done, your budget speech can definitely come to 1 hour.
Okay, let's spend a moment talking about employment and unemployment. On the Budget Intelligence Dashboard, I'll show you first what the current employment numbers, and these are from the Center for Monitoring of the Indian Economy. I'll show you monthly unemployment numbers first, which have been, and this doesn't account for the full unemployment picture, this only looks at the organized sector, but at about 7.9% in December 21, according to the CMIE. If you look at the annual figures, again, employment at about 7.5%, of course, because of the pandemic, it shot up. But has the situation recovered adequately after the pandemic? That's the critical question. And remember, in his 2019 budget speech, Arun Jaitley at that time had said that, there is no shortage of jobs, because if there was shortage of jobs, there'd be riots, and you'd see the riots play themselves out. And are you seeing any riots anyway? He asked this in Parliament while he was making that speech. And Udayan, we've seen now, whether it is in Prayagraj in Uttar Pradesh, whether it is in Gaya in Bihar, unemployment riots being described by some pundits as India's first unemployment riots, where you had 1.25 crore people asking for just about 25,000 odd jobs. that huge desire for jobs versus the inability of the government sector and the private sector to take care of the rising aspirations of these youngsters who are desperate in these pandemic-stricken times to find employment. How should Finance Minister Sitharaman be dealing with that challenge?
You know, the 7.9% number that he spoke about, Rahul, in unemployment is just the tip of the iceberg. It's, as you said, what is measured in organized data. There is other CMI data which talks about the number of people who are eligible for jobs, who are seeking jobs in large states like UP, Uttarakhand, Punjab, Goa even. You know, the number is like 30%, 33% of eligible people seeking jobs actually able to find a job. So 1 in 3 people can go out and find a job. That's the extent of the unemployment or the lack of jobs problem in India. But not just unemployment. You know, even if you want a job, you don't have a job. But India has never been a big jobs economy. I want to flag another issue, which is that the issue of small entrepreneurs and self-employed people. Because as I was telling you yesterday, there are 7 crore SMEs in India. Even if you assume that each of them employ 3 people, you're talking about 20 crore people. That segment has been hit so badly because these are the people who basically set up small shops, small hotels, small chai shops, if you will, and keep the wheels of the economy going because they don't have enough jobs. And all the packages which have happened during the COVID time has not addressed this problem adequately. So I think this is one segment which needs a lot of attention in this budget, though it will incite groans from Dalal Street to hear about small entrepreneurs, etc., because they are not listed. But I want to ask Mr. Garg about this. Mr. Garg, what is the way out of this problem? Because, you know, this SME issue is not getting addressed properly. I mean, they're doing fund of funds for MSMEs, etc., during the COVID time. But I don't think that is the answer to this problem, is it?
Very well. The fund of fund, that 10,000 crores which was announced in May 2020 has not taken off at all. And that when the basic SME funds in the country are not even 1,200 crores, how can a fund of fund make the investments commitment of 10,000 crores? That was literally, I think, for the sake of increasing numbers. The real problem to my mind in reaching out to the SMEs is that we have close to about 8 crores of these small businesses. 90% of them are single account, on account kind of thing, where either the guy works or he employs 1 or 2 laborers at best. Now, there is no way to reach out to these people in the country. We have not created any sort of database or any system. We incorporate, we register, we have a full-fledged companies affairs department to deal with about 12 to 13 lakh companies. But we have no system to deal with these 8 crores unincorporated enterprises. So unless you know how or you have the system to reach out to them, we end up at the every time to deal with about these 45 odd lakh larger SMEs, which avail from the banks, the finance, and that entire scheme of the emergency credit guarantee scheme was also meant for only these kind of SMEs and not for others. So I think we will need to create fundamental structures, institutional mechanisms to be able to reach out and help. The other problem which I think we have had in our country is that we have been sort of averse to equity infusion. We have been basically loans and the debt kind of. We have created a number of companies, institutions to provide debts, but hardly any. These small businesses need some equity support, some grant support to build their working capital and others. They don't have the means. I would just point out even that one scheme for the small vendors, if you would recall, which was created that during the pandemic relief packages, stimulus packages, it said that we'll provide 10,000 rupees of loan to these vendors who had lost their businesses, working capital during the lockdown.
Okay.
But we still wanted to them.
So
but we couldn't provide them because this is very difficult to reach out to them and then to provide loans to them.
No, sure. And the whole challenge of the urban dispossessed, at least in rural India, you have schemes like Manrega. The government is able to provide employment and monetary support to those who are in need. But in the urban sectors, and that came out strong during the pandemic and the lockdowns, the inability even to have, Rajdeep, a basic log of who all needs the support, how to transfer that support. Those are issues the government has been looking at. We'll see if the Finance Minister has any announcements on that score. We'll slip into a quick break. You're watching live and continuing coverage of the booster shot budget. Rajdeep, Udayan and I will return on the other side of a very quick break. Stay with us.
Crypto Watch brought to you by BitBNS.
Information is not knowledge. The only source of knowledge is experience. As a day of reckoning draws closer, Siddharth Zarabi, Rajdeep Sardesai, Rahul Kanwal and Udayan Mukherjee, with 30 plus years of budget reporting experience, India's leading English news channel and India's #1 business magazine, two mega brands get together to bring you the most comprehensive coverage of the coming budget 2022. India Today Roundtable Goa. Listen to leaders like Pramod Sawant, Arvind Kejriwal, Mahua Moitra, P. Chidambaram, Devendra Fadnavis, Sanjay Raut, Sudhin Dhavalikar, Vijay Sardesai, Utpal Parikar, Amit Palekar, Randeep Singh Surjewala, and many others only at India Today Roundtable Goa, 3rd February 2022.
You are watching India Today.
Co-presented by LIC, हर पल आपके साथ. Powered by Duraguard Cement, a Nuvoco product. In association with Snapdeal.
Yeah?
we've got these images of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman leaving Rashtrapati Bhavan on her way to North Block and then to Parliament to present the 4th Union Budget in her tenure. So far, India's had 23 finance ministers. It started back in 1860, and from then on, it's interesting that Nirmala Sitharaman will be the 8th finance minister who's had an opportunity to present 4 budgets. And in some senses, she has come into her own. Shankar, you've seen so many different finance ministers. The ups, downs, good budgets, not so good budgets, like the retrospective tax budget of Pranab Mukherjee. Initially, she seemed very ginger. She seemed a bit, like the occasion sometimes seemed to overwhelm her. But she has grown in confidence and has settled now into what is just another budget for her. So that whole halo that she had, the fear that she had about that everybody's looking at her, she's something that she's now pretty used to, and it's just another budget for her.
Well, I was thinking about this morning. This would be probably my 31st or 32nd budget. And in the whole course, she probably was one of the more conscious, sensitive finance ministers. And that's because you remember that she was pitchforked into high position first as defense minister and then brought in here. And somehow in the initial stage, there was always this rumor that, she might be there temporarily or she might be moved or whatever. But there is much broader acceptance of her performance since last year and since last year's budget. And this year, she's definitely come into her own. She's also got a good team, and that makes a lot of difference in terms of confidence. And the one consistency in her thing is that the Prime Minister has always backed her.
And what's interesting is this is a meteoric rise. When you look at Nirmala Sitharaman, I recall 2012, Gujarat elections were going on, and she was there in the party office as one of the spokespersons of the BJP. One of the spokespersons of the BJP did a very good job as party spokesperson. That's all she was. She was at the same level at the time as all the other spokespersons in the BJP, the Shah Nawaz Hussains, who in fact had been a minister in Mr. Vajpayee's cabinet. And Nirmala Sitharaman wasn't even an MP at the time. Now, exactly a decade later, from 2012 to 2022, one of the many party spokespersons has already been the defense minister of the country and now the finance minister of the country. So it's a remarkable meteoric rise that Nirmala Sitharaman has had within the BJP. I can tell you it sparked a fair amount of envy within a section of the BJP.
That's the finance minister
trusted by
reaching Parliament. I had an opportunity to ask 2 of the most important people in the country around the time of the reshuffle whether there was any buzz of changes in critical ministries at Raisina Hills. And the one thing that they said is that they have a lot of confidence in Nirmala Sitharaman. So she carries the confidence of the Prime Minister, of the Home Minister, and she really is blue-eyed in many ways for the powers that be in the BJP at this moment.
It's interesting. She doesn't have an independent political base. She comes from Tamil Nadu. Her husband has been very critical of this government. But Nirmala Sitharaman, I think both as defense minister when she held her own in the context of the attack that the opposition had on Rafale, and now in the context as finance minister in very tough times of the pandemic, I think she is the kind of perfect minister in this government. The Modi government likes efficient administrators rather than politicians as ministers. And that's an approach which has its drawbacks, because then the minister doesn't command an independent base of his or her own. But the advantage there is that that person will be seen as someone who will fall in line and will, in a way, conform to what the Prime Minister would like to see. There is criticism from time to time that it's the PMO which runs the Finance Ministry and not the Finance Minister herself. S.C. Garg, as someone who was Finance Secretary in an earlier time, is that true? At the end of the day, how much autonomy does the Finance Minister have in a Modi government which is very PMO-centric? Mr. Garg? Okay, we'll try and go back to Mr. Shamika Ravi, if you're with us, you want to take that? You've been with the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. One of the criticisms is the council doesn't meet often enough. The Prime Minister doesn't attend enough council meetings. Is this a government where the Finance Minister has the autonomy to shape the budget, or is it still very much a PMO-driven budget?
Well, we have clearly seen in the last budgets that she has presented that despite, remember, BJP's outlook on the economy is also very left-leaning in its, in its revealed preference. If you just look at the path over the last, let's say, 8 years. But Nirmala Sitharaman has clearly, especially in the last budget, I think she has very clearly broken off from there and not shied away from, very contentious and taboo issues like privatization. So I do think she has a mind of her own. She definitely has the blessings and full support of the Prime Minister. But I do want to, there's a small anecdote that I do want to share since you're talking about her. When I first moved to Delhi, one of my public lectures was in the University of Chicago, the Delhi Center. And it was on women in politics and why policies matter as far as promoting women within political parties. And she came to attend that lecture. And her comment at the end was that, I am a product of BJP's internal policies of promoting women. And, it did come across as someone who is extremely humble and very quick to learn in terms of, what is expected, and an extremely mature personality, given how noisy Delhi is. She clearly stood out right from the beginning. So I'm not surprised at all that, senior leadership within the party has put so much faith in Nirmala right from the beginning.
Let's, on the word clouds that we have, since Shamika spoke about the speech thrust analysis of past finance ministers, the Data Intelligence Unit at India Today has actually looked at different speeches. So I'll start with 2020-21, Nirmala Sitharaman. The thrust at that time most acutely was on agriculture and farmer. Those words spoken of 26 times each. Ayushman Bharat was another critical thrust, finding mention 17 times, education 14 times, water through the Jal Nidhi, another critical priority of the Prime Minister, spoken of 13 times. If we cut to the last speech, which is 2021 and 22, here you've got infrastructure being the big thrust for Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, which she spoke of 29 times. Linked to that is transport. That word featured 28 times. And because this came in the middle of the pandemic, health was amongst the sectors that was spoken of the most, been spoken of 25 times. And then, of course, Corona featured 16 times. And then there is Atmanirbhar Bharat, which was spoken of 14 times. Agriculture spoken of 12 times, the farmers spoken of 11 times. So if you add agriculture and farmer, that's 23, making it one of the words that found mention most frequently in the finance minister's speech. Udayan, the government has had to pull back its much wanted farm reforms, given the fact that you've got elections now in Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Punjab and elsewhere, and then later in the year in Goa, very little chance of any aggressive farm reforms being pushed through by this government in the near future or even in the long-term future. Given the political sensitivity, when contrasted with the desperate need to reform Indian agriculture, what room for maneuver does the finance minister really have when it comes to the issue of what the government can do to support agriculture and economic and agricultural growth?
It's a tough one, Rahul. I would say, instead of announcing new schemes on agriculture, stick to what is working. There was talk about Narega, and you talk about most of the agricultural belts. What has really worked last year is the uptick in Narega, more than any other farm scheme which the government might have announced. And there was criticism earlier about announcing too many schemes and implementing them properly. I would say look at Narega as an example, where you started the year by saying, I will spend 73,000 crores. Already you've spent 77,000 crores. And there is a huge demand, given the lack of jobs in rural areas, for more Narega. So I would say, why 100 days of work? Why not make it 150 days of work and increase the outlay of Narega? Because that is clearly one avenue where there is an incredible amount of demand in rural areas. So I would say, stick to policies or stick to schemes which are actually working, for which there is a serious amount of demand because of lack of jobs, rather than creating new schemes. Because the government's problem is one of administration, not necessarily of intentions or of announcements. You spoke about the fact that Nirmala Sitharaman mentioned education 14 times. You know what was the outlay last year in terms of budget outlay on education? It was 93,000 crores. Now, what kind of public spending is this on a sphere like education, on the size of budget that you run? You earmark a paltry 93,000 crores to education, and then you mention the word 14 times. So I don't think this is about announcements. It's about what you can get done. Yesterday, Nilkant Mishra was talking about the fact that 2.5% of GDP is lying in cash with the RBI. So you can announce any amount of capex and schemes, but you're not able to spend what you have announced. To the tune of 2.5% of GDP, 5 lakh crores is lying with the Reserve Bank in terms of cash. So I would say in this budget, my focus is not about what new schemes or what new announcements she can make for any sector, including agriculture, but actually spend what you're promising or committing to spend, and use the channels which are working for you, rather than trying to create even more channels which you don't have great administrative lean over.
Getting Ketan Dalal, Naushad Forbes joining us. We want to get you to respond to what is it that you're looking forward to in this budget? Naushad Forbes, why don't you pick it up first? Udayan set the cat among the pigeons, saying this is not a budget that should be about those who've licked the cream, not for those at the top of the pyramid, but for those at the bottom of the pyramid. What do you think is something you're looking forward to, Mr. Forbes, for you would be an important element in the budget this time?
I do agree with that view. It's important to recognize what impact the last 2 years has had on the economy. Larger companies are doing just fine. Companies with good positions are doing just fine. The people who've really been most affected are those who were in urban informal employment. So sectors like retail, hospitality, tourism, these are the sectors that not only were the most affected, but they're also the sectors that have been the most vibrant in terms of employment creation for the last 20 years. So that's really where we need to see a greater focus. Now, what can the government do in these areas? And we have to be clear that the government has a limited role that it can play in actually stimulating demand for services such as hospitality and tourism, such as retail. What can it actually do? It can spend on infrastructure. So the most direct way in which the government can employ people and put low-skilled people to work is through really rapid deployment of infrastructure. So what I will be listening to in the budget speech is not announcements of the infrastructure pipeline and so on, which have already been done, but how will that pipeline start actually delivering a high flow of rupees on the ground that is spent and therefore employing people and turning into productive infrastructure for the country. Second, I will be looking at the kind of not just words, as was pointed out earlier, but the actions for education and health. Education and health, especially school education and public health, are state subjects under our constitution. So again, the union government has a limited role to play, but it can play a very important role by using finance to actually incentivize the right actions, the right programs by state governments. So the new education policy has an excellent scheme, an excellent proposal to ensure second standard outcomes for all children around the country. Hearing something about that in the budget would be most welcome to me.
Mr. Dalal, what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, so I think primarily from the perspective of direct taxes and picking the baton from where Naushad left off, the smaller organizations, the MSMEs, today are normally in the form of partnerships or LLPs, and they pay tax at 36%. Compared to that, companies pay at the rate of 25%, which is a very competitive rate. So I am hoping that there will be some rationalization of rates on partnerships and LLPs. So that's one part. The second part is, even for individuals, the tax rates are quite high. The maximum rate of 30% kicks in for incomes about 10 lakhs, and I think that's a very low threshold. It needs to be enhanced. And of course, when you go above 50 lakhs, etc., the rate of surcharge takes the tax rates to 34, 36, 39, and then to 43, all of which are punitive rates, and that needs to be rationalized. We have also had talks about standard deduction, but when the rates and standard deduction are overall rationalized, I think the bottom line is that the overall tax burden should reduce, because that will also spur consumption. One more aspect is, business reorganizations are, the tax issues on business reorganizations are quite heavy. So, for example, conversion of a company into an LLP, the conditionalities on demerger. There are a variety of provisions which are extremely restrictive. And one wishes that these kind of restrictive provisions and very detailed definitions are diluted and business reorganization is facilitated. One last point I wanted to make was, today you have so many disputes in law that I think it is very important that at all three stages of the dispute chain, so for example, prevention of disputes, the actual disputes itself, like the appellate process, and then the other dispute alternative processes, they need a lot of focus. We had an advance ruling scheme which didn't work. That has been replaced by another one which has not worked at all. So one really wishes that the advance ruling schemes and the dispute resolution schemes are meaningfully implemented, because this is again an implementation issue, with an ecosystem that incentivizes fair and quick decision making, and you don't need to look all the time over your shoulder. So I think these are some of the issues that one would hope.
So stay with us. We've got these pictures of the Prime Minister reaching Parliament now. He's flanked by Dr. Jitendra Singh in the Prime Minister's office. Udayan wants to come in and ask a question. Udayan, go on.
Yeah, Rahul, I had a question for Naushad, because I heard Ketan Dalal just talking about the fact that taxes at the higher end of the pyramid should come down. Naushad, what's your thought? I mean, you spoke about inequality and the fact that the lower end of the pyramid has been hurting a lot. Does that make the case for progressive taxation strong? I mean, corporate taxes have been cut to 25%. One can understand that because companies create jobs. But what about the wealthy? I mean, at a time when the wealthy have got wealthier and the poor have got poorer, should there be a case, or could there be a case for taxes like a wealth tax, inheritance tax, or even a higher capital gains tax? Because people are making quite a bit of money even through difficult times. Should money be taken away from them and redistributed? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the argument that was being made was for a cut in income tax rates. I would be a beneficiary, but I don't believe that the current timing is right for anything like that. I think at present the best tax policy is actually to leave tax rates untouched. That if you actually leave them untouched, you will end up with a stable environment, which ends up being more secure from the decision-making perspective. Now, in terms of your question on wealth taxes and so on, I think you should look at our history and look at what they actually resulted in. Did it actually lead to buoyant revenues, or did it lead to activity at the end of the day that was counterproductive from an economic perspective? And it seems to me that the data would show that it was very counterproductive. And you may have taxes that sound like good taxes, but they're actually ineffective. Look at our history. Look at from 1991 through to 2017, we saw successive reductions in income taxes. With each round of reduction in income taxes, tax collections went up, right? So that's what you're interested in. You're interested in tax buoyancy. You're interested in more collections. And if you actually incentivize the creation of wealth, that's what you'll get. Having said that, I come back to the point earlier that I don't think this is the year for a tax cut. I think sticking with the existing rates is the right thing for now. When the economy improves substantially, when we are creating employment at the lower end of the pyramid in a widespread way once again, I think that's the time to go back and look at tax rates afresh.
Shamika, you want to comment on that, on whether there is a case for taxing the people who are actually doing quite well in the economy and trying to redistribute that? If the wealth tax is an inefficient tax, that point is taken. But is the case for some kind of progressive taxation higher than it's ever been before?
Dr. Ravi, did you hear that? Okay, so we've got these pictures of what's happening in Parliament. Prime Minister Modi reaching the cabinet meeting, which is customary right ahead of the budget currently underway, and in a short while after that, the budget will be presented in Rajdeep. There isn't much time, only till the 11th of February in the first part of the budget session. Then there's a recess because of the elections, and they convene around the 14th after the counting on the 10th of March. But there will be the Pegasus issue, which the opposition is very keen on taking up. The Prime Minister said yesterday, talk about anything you want, let there be healthy disruption, let there be healthy discussion, but let's not have undue disruptions.
Freudian slip, let there be healthy disruption, because that's probably what's going to happen. You know, you're probably going to get disruption starting tomorrow. But, you know, the one point that we haven't looked at, therefore, is that this is a budget in the shadow of elections. In a week from now, you have 5 weeks of elections, including in India's most populous state, the state that is most crucial to the BJP's future, i.e. Uttar Pradesh. So, last time the budget was in the shadow of the farmer protests. This time the budget is in the shadow of an election. So there is a certain element of political calls that are taken which at times affect economic decisions. And I think that's the worry. That's been the concern of all budgets of all finance ministers over the years, that we are in this endless cycle of elections. So one eye is on ensuring that you have these headlineable points that influence electorate, particularly I think in this election, the rural electorate. You've got Punjab and Uttar Pradesh, more specifically Uttar Pradesh, where there has been a large amount of farmer unrest in the last year. And jobs are a critical issue for the young. You've seen youth unrest in states like Bihar. So I think for the government at the moment, there will be, if not one eye, certainly half an eye on the elections. And that can influence budget decision making at times. At least you need to give the sense that you've created a budget which will get the voter to believe that the government is on the right track. But Udayan, a question that a friend has asked me just now, please ask Udayan, what are the sectors to look at in this budget which will kickstart the markets? There's a concern that the markets have been volatile over the last week. Any particular sectors that you're going to be looking at closely?
I'll break it up into 3 clusters for your friend Rajdeep. Depending on various outcomes in the speech over the next couple of hours, these are the sectors which will do well at least for a while in terms of sentiment. One is if the finance minister says that fiscal deficit is 6.8% this year, next year I bring it down to anywhere between 6.2 to 6.4%, and I stick to my target of getting to 4.5% by 2026. The result of that statement, which is returning to the path of fiscal moderation, will actually see bond yields cooling down, and that will be received well by banking stocks. So financial stocks will do well if fiscal deficit signals are on the way down. That's one way to read it. So that's one cluster for your friend. The other cluster is the finance minister says that I'm not in any hurry to bring down the fiscal deficit very significantly or very quickly. I will reduce it little bits at a time depending on how tax collections come about. But I want to focus more on growth. And she explicitly says that growth is a priority for me and therefore capex and not so much fiscal consolidation. Then banks will not do as well because interest rates will harden. What will do well is consumer discretionary stocks because she's focusing on growth, creating more jobs and income. That will stimulate demand, and consumer discretionary stocks, cars, consumables, those kind of consumer stocks will do well. And if she explicitly talks about capex spending in a big way, then I think what is capex in India? Capex largely is roads, railways and defense. Then I would say defense is an important part here. So I would say then you would start to focus on some of the construction companies and some of the defense companies like Bharat Electronics, Hindustan Aeronautics, where capex in defense is going up, and that's an important political point that you guys might want to pick up the way defense spending is going up now on capital expenditure because of the perceived threat or heightened threat perception from China. So defense might be an important part. So I would focus on defense and infrastructure stocks if there is an explicit commitment to capex in a big way in the budget. So banks, consumer discretionary, and infrastructure, depending on what she says, these are the three clusters I would look at closely.
That you're saying that defense spending is going up, because if I walk across to the budget intelligence dashboard and show our viewers how defense expenditure as a portion of our GDP is actually stagnant. It went up really fast during the Rajiv Gandhi years, but after that, if you look at defense spending, and I'm comparing here China, India and Pakistan, so the red line right at the top is China with $252 billion of investment. After that is India with 72.9 and Pakistan with 10.4, but it's a rather flat line. So the trend isn't one of an incline, it's a rather flat line. And this is as far as the overall defense spending is concerned. Let's now look at the defense GDP ratio, defense as a part of our total GDP. Here you're actually seeing defense spending as compared to our GDP coming down from 2.6% in FY16, went up to 2.9% in FY17, 3.1 in FY20 was the peak, and coming down to 2.2% in FY21. This despite the threat from China, this despite the mobilization of forces all the way from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh. Now remember, the government's logic here is that we're using our funds more judiciously. Earlier funds were wasted and therefore weren't adequately used. We're pushing Atmanirbhar Bharat and therefore trying to ensure that there is maximum bang for the buck. But the fact is that in comparison with other countries, we're still spending less, and in comparison with our own GDP, the percentage of spend on defense is actually coming down, and that is problematic. Saurav Majumdar joins us. Saurav is the editor of Business Today magazine, has been looking very carefully at the preparation for the budget. Saurav, you've looked at Nirmala Sitharaman's budgets in the past and the build-up to this budget. People who are watching at this time, your best sense of what they should expect from Nirmala Sitharaman in about 25 minutes from now?
Well, Rahul, I think we've had discussions on what the various options before her, but I think this time, and I would agree with Udayan, who has said yesterday and today, that we really need to focus on the MSMEs and the unorganized sector. I think that itself, talking about a positive element even before the elections. If she manages to give clear signals in terms of the support the government will lend to MSMEs, making them more export friendly, making their products, giving them better access to credit, and more importantly, giving better access to technology, helping them become more self-sufficient in line with the overall Atmanirbhar Bharat theme. I think that itself will have a multiplier effect which can create jobs as well. So I think the MSME sector will be critical, and I would expect and hope that she will make some serious announcements to, because that's a large multiplier, and that's a large and very strong sort of growth multiplier for the economy. Also, as we have discussed earlier, I think there is definitely a clear signal needed in terms of the roadmap for disinvestment, privatization and asset monetization. I think also, expenditure going to productive segments. And we've again talked about earlier in the show as well as yesterday about expenditure lagging behind, actual expenditure lagging behind. So it's not just about announcements. We need clear signals and a roadmap. Budgets these days are not just about accounting. Budgets are also about setting the reform agenda, and this government has done fairly well on some of these aspects, like setting a roadmap for the future. They do believe in the barbell agile approach, the combination of the two, so they want to set a structure for the future. I think this budget, at least I will be looking forward to some clear signals in terms of what the next 2 to 3 years would be for the Indian economy, and definitely expenditure and support to MSMEs.
Well, then one of the things the economic survey speaks about is that a lot of the money that's being raised is actually being raised from the capital markets, not so much from bank credit. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And what can the finance minister possibly do to nudge banks to lend more, and for private sector to actually go to banks asking them for more loans so that they can kickstart their investment projects?
It can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, Rahul. I would say it's a two-edged thing, because this year might be a rougher year in a sense of raising capital, private equity capital or capital market funds for the kind of growth revival that you're talking about, because last year was very supportive in terms of private equity, in terms of companies coming to the market and raising capital. The IPO market was booming. I think this year might be more restrictive because of the kind of volatility that we're seeing in the global space. And therefore, the lens might turn to the banking sector, because credit growth is, while it is better than what it was a couple of years ago in 2020, I think it's still quite tepid by going by historical comparisons. And we do need a credit cycle in this country, a full-fledged credit cycle, because that has a kind of a multiplier effect. And I don't think we can have serious recovery and revival without bank credit picking up very significantly in this, or quite significantly in this country. And in that, there is a fly in the ointment, because while bank balance sheets are much better now than they were even a couple of years ago, and there is a huge amount of repair which has happened, I think there is a creeping problem of delinquencies which is creeping in because of the pandemic. And I think at the retail level, you will find that some warning signs are already beginning to flash, so far kept under the carpet. But I hope 2022 does not bring to the fore a fairly ugly consumer or retail delinquency cycle for the banking sector to face up to, because that would be very, very problematic. But this is one area which I would watch very, very carefully. Bank credit that you've just raised, and how it fleshes out, supporting the capex cycle that we all expect this year from the corporate space.
Udayan, you're saying that in a way, this is the ideal budget to perhaps for the finance minister to feel far more comfortable about the state of the economy compared to 21 and 20, which were budgets completely in the shadow of the pandemic. Now you've got vaccinations, you've got clear signs that the country's got Omicron under control. Shamika, Ravi, in 20 and 21, the government could perhaps make the excuse that, look, we are in a pandemic, there have been lockdowns, that's been responsible for the slowing growth. This time, presumably, the government, in a sense, has a huge opportunity. Because if you look from 2017, post-demonetization, the economy slowed down. There have been serious question marks why quarter after quarter, and this stretches back to pre-pandemic levels, the government hasn't met its growth targets. Do you see 2022, therefore, as a huge opportunity for the government to, in a way, get back at the critics who say post-demonetization, this is an economy that has slowed down?
Well, Rajdeep, it's not just post-demonetization. I know you like to dwell on it, but I think what you ought to be really highlighting is the fact that for 10 years, private investments have not picked up. So there are structural problems. There are things that are so fundamentally broken, which is what the effort over the last 7-8 years have been to really mend it. So if you look at the banking system, or for that matter, just trying to get some of the regulations around easier flow of money out of bad assets in the, that has been a concern. But I get your point that clearly this year is better compared to the last 2 years, because we were firefighting, right? As a country, there were more emergency humanitarian supports. There were more from the point of view of making lives of ordinary people, easier from a day-to-day life perspective. So it was mostly health, food grains, cash support, etc. Now it's a bit different. I do think that the pandemic is receding. I think we have to look forward. We cannot be now struck just within that pandemic view of the world. But an important thing to remember is that earnings have fallen. Earnings have fallen particularly much more than national average for youths of Uttar Pradesh. Now, these are the kind of things that should weigh in on this budget. And I'm hoping, and I'm guessing it will. Because, of course, in a democracy, eventually governments do respond to these kind of emergencies. But while unemployment for the youth is generally a longer-term problem, it has worsened after the pandemic. But the earnings have worsened in some areas far more than the others. And UP on that count has suffered. And that's why when I say a welfareist budget is what my expectation is, it's not about urban Narega. In fact, I would unequivocally say that urban Narega is a bad idea. I don't think, in fact, the better response would be just strengthening SMEs and making it feasible for MSMEs to go back to business as usual, or just growing, the kind of things that Udayan has been talking about since yesterday. I think those are the right measures. But
from Parliament,
still,
that the cabinet meeting is over.
Right? These are big
the cabinet has approved the union budget, which is a formality that is required before the budget is presented by the Finance Minister on the floor of the House. That starts in about 23 minutes. We've also got Supriya Shrineth of the Congress who's joining us. We've heard from the opposition. We've heard from the government. We can get a word from the opposition. Those are images from a little earlier of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman at the gate of the Parliament building, going in with her team as she presents her budget. Supriya, the worst from the pandemic perspective is most likely, and God willing, hopefully behind us. Would you then say that, from the opposition's perspective, the problem could be that this is where the Indian economy could potentially take off from? The last 2 years have been tough, but given all the shocks the economy has had to deal with, we could be on a path to growth from here, and which would, in some time, have the government be able to show pretty high growth numbers, as we're seeing high export numbers and high tax collections right now.
No, so thank you very much for having me, and I take objection to the fact that the opposition will have any issues with economic recovery. Of course there should be economic recovery. Why wouldn't there be economic recovery? The issue is the government focusing on economic recovery, and what exactly is it doing about it? I will only point 4 things to you that this budget should focus on. Number 1 has to be employment creation, and employment has to come from the small, medium-sized enterprises. They have to be the focus. So employment generation, curbing inflation, agriculture. Remember, this budget is coming after a huge agriculture unrest in this country. And of course, the rising income inequality, the concentration of wealth in the hands of very, very few people. But it looks like, at least the economic survey seems to indicate that all is well, and the government is still in denial about the very fault lines that exist in the economy. I will only point out that everybody wants economic recovery, but is the government willing to walk the talk? Is the government willing to focus on the bottom of the pyramid, on the small, medium enterprises, which are the real job guzzlers? The action doesn't seem to be meeting the words right now. And I only also want to point out that in the last budget, the agri and allied industries actually got less allocation than the previous budget. I hope there will be a larger allocation, because this was the month, February was the month when agriculture income was supposed to be doubled. The average farmer is today earning 27 rupees a day. The average unemployment in the country is higher than ever before. So what is the government willing to do about these structural issues which have come to plague? And I joined a little earlier, and you guys were discussing about how Nirmala Sitharaman enjoys the confidence of the Prime Minister. She very well does. I admire her as a woman to be in a very powerful position that she is, but she doesn't seem to enjoy the confidence of investors or the consumers, because consumption is down and investment is down. And unless you do not put that virtuous cycle of motion back, it is not going to revive the Indian economy. Indian economic revival depends on consumption and on investments coming back, and for that you need an income boost. You need a Nyaya-like Yojana. There is no other way about it. Over the short term, of course over the medium to long term, jobs have to come back into the center of focus. The economic survey, if you ask me, belies hopes of that talk being walked today.
Okay, we're just receiving word that the union budget has been approved by the cabinet, and in a short while from now will be presented on the floor of the House by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. This whole challenge of job creation is indeed one of the biggest challenges that Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will deal with, and one of the aspects that's coming out strong is that the government has limited maneuverability in being able to create jobs by itself, and therefore Udayan, your thoughts on how the Finance Minister should be dealing with the challenge of job creation? What can the government possibly do to stimulate job creation to the extent possible in the private sector, and also as far as different government departments and ministries are concerned?
Not as much as we would like to believe, Rahul. It's very specious to say that the finance minister will do something which will automatically create a lot of jobs, because India has a jobs problem. It's best to recognize that. India also has very limited fiscal space. Our debt to GDP is running close to 90%. With that kind of a debt to GDP and the kind of interest payments you have to make, you don't have a lot of elbow room to go about creating millions of jobs. You can do two things. You can address, one hand, the SME problem that we've all been speaking about, because that is a real creator of jobs, and I'm sure something will be done in this budget on that front. The real creator of jobs in this country is actually the corporate sector. For that, you basically create an enabling environment, which is what the government has been doing. I mean, they've cut corporate taxes to 25%, which is the first step in inducing companies to go out and spend on capex. Now, companies do capex, as I was saying yesterday, when they have a virtuous profit cycle. We are just at the beginning of a good earnings cycle. Give it a few more quarters, and companies will probably have the confidence to come and spend again, and you will then have a capex cycle. The other is capacity utilization, which is nudging 70-75% in many industries. If that inches up to 80%, then companies will find the confidence to increase capacity and more jobs will be created. The government has done tax cuts. It is doing PLI. PLI might be a source of creation of jobs again. And then there are other things like the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which, if it is pulled off, can be a big creator of jobs. So enable the corporate sector, do something directly on the SME front, and maybe some jobs will be created. But as I said earlier, the government is only 2.5% of India's GDP in terms of capex. It can only nudge the wheel so much. So keep your expectations low. I think it's best to focus on MSMEs for this budget.
Sanjeev Bajaj joins us, Managing Director and Chairman of Bajaj FinServ. One of the things that's come out in the economic survey is on credit offtake. And your thoughts, Mr. Bajaj, on what Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman should be doing to try and get more companies in the private sector to actually go and borrow more so that they can go out and invest in new greenfield projects?
If you actually see, the credit offtake has been reasonably good with the MSME, the SME sector. And we also at CI recently did a survey where over 50% of our members who were surveyed mentioned that they'd already started investing in a new capex cycle, which means over the next 3-4 quarters, you'll see the benefit of that coming in. And all this is only happening because the larger situation around us is getting more stable in this pandemic. We can see in this current wave, it's been handled really well. Healthcare is all in place, and the vaccination rates have finally come to a very high level. And as a result, there is less disruption in the individual citizens' life, in the lives of businesses. This creates greater confidence, and it helps with the consumption cycle. It helps demand increase. And we need to see a continuation of this. So I hope that we see a continuation in the focus on healthcare, anticipating the next wave, getting ready ahead in time, whether with the right medical advice, getting boosters to more of the population, mix and match, the next set of therapeutics, proactively working with these companies so that we get ready for a possible another wave. And this main thing is to avoid the disruption, minimize the disruption like has been handled so well in this particular wave. In addition, the government should continue its spend on infrastructure. And as we do this, private sector capex will also kick in. As I mentioned, we should continue to see good growth.
Sanjeev, you actually have operations in many small cities across the country in rural and semi-urban areas. What is your sense of the kind of labor issues or unemployment problem out there, and what would be your recipe for the finance minister to try and address that? But that's because that seems to be a very real problem over the last couple of years, which has only gotten worse.
You know, that's actually something that is so important, because as you go to smaller cities, we set up branches, offices in smaller cities. For us to get quality manpower that don't just have a degree, but they know how to work, becomes a big challenge. And also, when you look at the youngsters over there, they've done their education, but they just don't know how to work in a formal institutional setup. So there is this big gap. And that's why as CI, we've always focused on skill building. We think the government needs to review its skill building plans, put a lot more focus on that, bring in additional capacity and quality. Everybody does not need to go and become a startup and a CEO in a large company. There are a whole bunch of jobs that can be done at the front end that can give employment to hundreds of millions of Indians. They just need to be trained correctly. So I believe this is a big need. It's something that government, public sector, private sector all need to invest their money and do this, because it's something that takes time to do, to get the quality right, to build capacity. But it will also give us the long-term benefit, the manpower, employment, and all the other positives that go with it.
Now, you have a terrific collection mechanism at Bajaj Finance, but you also have the pulse of what the retail mood is like, Sanjeev. So tell me, given the fact that incomes have been hit so badly over the last couple of years and the unemployment issues linger, as you yourself said, is there a delinquency problem which is looming for the retail or the consumer segment over the next year or so? Could that start to creep into the banking system stealthily? Because people are not talking about it. We are celebrating the fact that we have seen the worst of the NPA cycle. But could something like a retail NPA cycle start to manifest itself, given the way incomes have been hit at the lower end of the pyramid?
So very clearly, as you're mentioning, it was at the lower end of the pyramid that incomes got hit. It was the informal sector, and that's where the government provided support through the moratorium year before last, and through the second wave, where there was no such moratorium. Actually, lenders did reasonably well because they had provided for it. They had gone and raised capital, and a large amount of that NPAs actually flew through for many of us through last year. Interestingly, though, when you go one or two segments up and see the middle class consumption, almost nobody in the middle class lost jobs. Companies continue to employ them, continue to pay them. Maybe increments didn't come in year before last. Last year has been reasonably decent, and the middle class has started spending. So that has added a positive spin to this whole thing. And even when I see the last couple of months, and especially January through this pandemic, since, as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic on the ground has been handled very well. We are continuing to see good momentum, especially in urban India. Rural India in the last couple of months has slowed down, and the government needs to focus on that. And as you correctly mentioned, that even in urban India, focus on those at the lower end of the income segment.
Rahul? In a way, comes, as we've been saying, Mr. Bajaj, at a time when perhaps the government can breathe a little bit more easily than they could in the last 2 years because of the pandemic. The fact that large parts of the adult population are vaccinated should give some cause for comfort. Do you believe, therefore, that the opportunity this time is there to send out much stronger signals than we could in the last 2 years to actually get growth on, back to where we would have liked to see it even pre-pandemic? At the moment, the comparison is to 2020 February. We would like to see the comparison possibly to a pre-2017 India, or some of us would like to see. Do you see that happening?
I absolutely hope so, and the confidence comes from the fact that last year, given the situation, was a good budget. We can see the benefit of that coming in. Our fiscal deficit hopefully will turn out to be lower than what was anticipated. We have seen that indirect tax and direct tax collection has been strong, which shows that the economy is humming, coming back. The investments that the government has been making in infrastructure and what it has started making in healthcare are also positives. And yes, as you said, we have to keep building on this, because as the government continues to build on this, private sector investment is coming back. So you're going to see a multiplier effect as a result of this in the coming years.
Pranav Satya, Chair at FICCI Committee on Taxation, partner and national leader with us at the moment. Pranav, are you joining us at this moment? No, I don't think he's with us. Pranav, you want to tell us from a taxation perspective what you're looking at in this budget? I think you're on mute, Pranav. You'll have to unmute yourself. Can you hear?
In this budget is stability From a direct tax standpoint in particular, and overall from a taxation standpoint, I think right now the mood of the country is good and nothing should be done which would probably upset that. Yes, there could be a few things like promoting private capex. For example, extending the concessional tax rate of 17% till 25 because of the pandemic the last 2 years has not enabled companies to invest and start new projects or bring it to such a stage that they can start production before March 23. So we think that's one good thing that could be done very clearly. Also, what we believe is that a lot of fillip is possible for capex, and particularly in the green energy and new emerging space. And that's where we feel some SOPs or some incentives could probably help. But by and large, our mood right now is to promote innovation, R&D efforts, green energy, and overall to see how the environment can be kept as stable, predictable, so that industry gets the confidence to invest, which I think is the need of the hour. And once that happens and that kicks in, I think there will be enough growth and employment generation to lift the entire economy to newer heights.
We just have I want to take you through how the sectoral spends have been under Finance Minister Sitharaman, and it will be interesting to see what her focus really has been. Udayan spoke about education not getting the kind of priority that it should over the last 2 years, especially as children have been locked up at home. Now, as schools start reopening, the need to ensure that education gets a boost. If you see, from about FY20 to now, which is the budget estimate, you've had a pretty flat line on education. So it was 67.2 thousand crore rupees in FY16 to FY22, which is 93.3 thousand crore rupees. There hasn't been a significant uptick. It's a rather flat line. Let's come to healthcare. In healthcare, because of the allocations made for the purchase of vaccines, there was an increase in the last year. But if you look at the trend line from a longer perspective, healthcare spending has been going up, but not quite the way that you'd want in a country like India, given the kind of challenges that we saw at a time like the pandemic. Let's now look at some of the critical infrastructure projects. Now, I'll take roads, for example, which now seem to be plateauing. Under Nitin Gadkari, for the initial years of the Modi Sarkar, the speed at which new road networks were being built every year was very high. Just over the last few months, partly because of the COVID lockdowns, also because of Omicron, the speed at which we are building highway capacity has actually slowed down. And that's something that we need to look at. Is that now the new trend? Have we built enough roads, or is that just a temporary blip caused by the pandemic? Let's look at railway infrastructure. Again, when it comes to railway infrastructure, this is the operating ratio at 96.2. Remember, now you've got the railway budget, which is part of the general budget. There isn't a separate railway budget as there used to be before Prime Minister Modi came in, and that's been one of the big changes that he's made, where there's just one combined statement of accounts. This is power generation at 392 gigawatts. These are the numbers till the 31st of December, an increase from about 298 in FY16. Let's look at Manrega, where I'll take a look first at funds released by the government for the Manrega scheme. And when he was in the opposition, Prime Minister Modi called this a monumental testimony to the UPA's failures. He has been increasing allocations year after year from FY16, especially FY21, seeing 1.11 lakh crore rupees being given till the 30th of January. In this year, 76.6 thousand crore rupees have been spent. Let's look at the effective wage rates, the amount of money a Manrega worker makes, which was 154 rupees in FY16, going up to 180 in FY20. Then currently, as of the 30th of January, 205.3 rupees. So an increase of about 50 rupees in the last 6 years in the average wage rate on Manrega. Let's look at the employment numbers now. This is the average days of employment each person received, which is currently at 46.2. It was 48.9 in FY16. Let's take a look at some of the Prime Minister's pet schemes. This is what will give you a broad sense of where we're at currently, where we've been over the last few years. I'll start with the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, where 7.5 thousand crore rupees were allocated in FY16. In FY21, 12,300 crore rupees were allocated. For the next 5 years, 1.41 lakh crore rupees have been allocated. By looking at these numbers, Udayan, your sense between Ujjwala, Swachh Bharat, Ayushman Bharat, Awas Yojana, your sense of where the Prime Minister's priorities, where the Finance Minister's priorities when it comes to these pet schemes really is most likely to be?
You know, you have to separate the two, Rahul. I mean, we are talking about revenue expenditure on one hand and capital expenditure on another hand. When we started the year in the FY21 budget, the Finance Minister said that she will focus more on capital expenditure. What you spoke about just now, things like roads, railways, defense, and housing, that's the bulk of capital expenditure. She said that capital expenditure will go up 26% and revenue expenditure, Narega, Prime Minister schemes, etc., those will actually go down 5%. What actually happened is that revenue expenditure, all these schemes, because of COVID and the need for relief, that actually went up 8%, and we have not spent as much as on capital expenditure as we thought at the start of the year. So broadly speaking, CapEx is basically growth oriented, simplifying it, and RevEx is relief oriented. RevEx actually did well in 2022 and CapEx did not do as well, though it's better than pre-COVID years. So this year we have to see whether we dial back revenue expenditure a little bit from the schemes that you're talking about and focus more on shoring up capital expenditure on things like roads, railways, which have job creation possibilities and multiplier possibilities, and where the thrust would be. Would it be roads? Would it be defense? Would it be housing? Because of the total capex kitty, roads, railways and defense make up 80%. The rest is housing and other things. So what will actually be the biggest job creation avenues? And that's the one I would be looking forward to in the budget very, very closely. But I'm told that Vinayak Chatterjee has joined in and he's actually an expert on this subject. Vinayak, are you with us now?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Right. I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the best way of capex expenditure? I mean, if the finance minister says that she will increase capex by 25, 27% or 30% this year, what would you want the thrust of that capex to be on?
You know, this year, I would actually expect the thrust to be on water. Because the program Jal Jeevan Mission is actually one of the most powerful utilities connectivity program since independent India to give potable tap water. And the ministry has done a commendable job in planning out the entire aspect of 24/7. And I think, like for the 2024 elections, what rural roads and gas cylinders and stuff did for winning goodwill towards the government, piped water is going to be the single biggest driver of goodwill from Aam Aadmi, from Bharat. So I'm actually expecting a far higher allocation to water than the standard road rail mix in the past. But let me stop here.
The only reason we are stopping you is because we've got just a couple of minutes to go for the budget announcement. But Vinayak Chatterjee, there is a sense that we have these outlays, but we've got to also look at outcomes. Mr. Modi has often spoken about, that judge me by outcomes, not by outlays. The time has come for that in critical sectors, health, education, which have taken a hit in pandemic times. Social sector spending needs to be matched by outcomes in those critical areas.
I obviously, nobody can disagree with you on that statement, but I will have to say that while social sector outcomes are eagerly watched, there are many sectors in core infrastructure where the outcomes are very clearly positive and visible. Roads has just had a temporary blip, but we are operating between 35 to 40 kilometers a day, which is astounding by world standards. So forget the temporary blip of COVID and rains and all that. If you see railway electrification and railway projects,
going very well. If you see Nal Se Jal, Jal Jeevan Mission going very well. So there are these outcomes that are pretty decent in core infrastructure. In social infrastructure, I completely agree with you that we will have to renew our focus on outcomes. There is no question that we have to do that.
Okay, just a couple of minutes to go, Rahul. As I said, this is a budget where Nirmala Sitharaman has the opportunity to, in a sense, set us on the post-pandemic road back to growth.
And it's interesting that you mentioned it, because what the economic survey clearly brings out to them, that the government has headroom to spend because of healthy GST collections, and I'll show that to you on the budget intelligence dashboard. Because of healthy tax collections as well, the government has the spending power, which typically it struggles for. And the challenge here instead is that they haven't spent enough, partly because of the lockdowns, partly because of the pandemic. So the FY22 is in the yellow color, so 1.38 lakh crores, the highest collection so far. And if you look at the trend line, this is in previous years, and the line right on top is the line for FY22, which suggests that tax collections are up, and that it will be interesting to see where the government decides to prioritize. Vinayak Chatterjee made an important point that water will be critical, and that will be interesting for us to look at. Here we see Om Birla, the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, come in. Udayan, final thoughts as we get set to hear Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman.
Two major numbers to watch out for, Rahul, in this budget. One is the fiscal deficit number and what it's set at next year, down to 6.4%, and the capex number, by how much it goes up, whether 25-30% next year.
Okay, so there you have Om Birla, Speaker of the Lok Sabha. The House fully, all the MPs in. We are going to have, remember, a short budget session before a recess on the 11th of February.